Hello, this is Yurick. I'm delighted to be here today, if only on film, on video, or in spirit, so to speak. It's a shame that we are coming together this way, and at some point in time we will come together actually in person. And it is also a shame, I might add, that our two countries are experiencing the difficulties that they have on the highest levels, and that the difficulties that they are encountering should center so much around technological issues. Perhaps this time will pass. I want to talk a little bit today about information technology, to talk specifically about the kinds of social effects that computers are having at this point in time, and what this may mean for our future. The leading metaphor of our time seems to be information. Information is in itself an elusive quantity, but it is a quantity, especially as it's handled by the kinds of computers that we have, which are fundamentally and at bottom adding machines. Adding machines which by their computations can create varieties of illusions of reality, illusions that indicate that words are being transmitted, that in fact figures are being sent back and forth, that even images of all kinds in all kinds of fantastic illusional situations can transmigrate as it were, back and forth between all countries. Now the implication of this for our time, what especially fascinates me, is that the boundaries between all countries are being eroded. At the same time, there is a contrary kind of motion, and that motion is to create greater and greater degrees of nationalism. So as we have boundaries breaking down, we have boundaries at the same time springing up. I find this a rather peculiar kind of contradiction in this day and age, especially when we sit at the edge of another technological kind of holocaust, in short, the nuclear bomb. What I have been concerned is the effect of this technology and the effect of the information revolution, or so-called revolution, on our modes of thinking and on our modes of behaving. I, for instance, used to write my novels using a typewriter. Now, of course, I use a computer, which I use in a sense as a typewriter with a screen. And what this does is kind of fascinating, because it allows me to get through many, many pages of manuscript at one point very, very quickly, to take, as it were, almost metaphorical leaps. Contrary-wise, what begins to happen is the desire and the ability, without any great difficulty, to write and rewrite endlessly. So what happens is, on one level, the technology speeds things up, and more information becomes available to us. On the other hand, the technology tends to slow us down. But there's another danger that occurs. What happens is we begin to think of this technological aspect as having, as it were, a kind of a group mind of its own. The group mind, in a sense, we begin to inspirit it, as it were. We begin to assign to it a kind of life. We say more and more that the computer is like a brain, right? Whereas, in fact, there has been no instrumentality, nor, I will assert, will there ever be any instrumentality that will supersede the brain. I think it's a fact worth noting that any one brain has more computational and associative power than all the computers in the world. And this is important to remember. But what happens is another thing that is troubling. As we get rooted more and more, focused on our screens, we begin to view this not only as a brain, but as the real world itself. And the real world, the so-called real world, the world in a sense of things, becomes metaphysical. Well, this is an illusion. Those who are in a position to play with all this stuff and not go out into the real world, as it were, can indulge themselves in this illusion, but around them there is space to be traversed, people to be seen, people to walk past, cars to be driven, and more than that, as the informational structure of the world becomes richer and fuller, the material aspects of the world becomes more and more debilitated and depleted. I have a kind of a nightmare. The nightmare is that there will come a time when what will happen is that a certain subsection of the world's population, no more than maybe a few million people, right, will be seated in front of their computers and will only be able to communicate with each other in this way. Right? That is, if you want to talk to somebody who may be in the next room, you don't get up, you send messages back and forth. And what does this do? For one thing, the aspect that has to be considered is the price of all this. Another aspect that has to be considered is the distance traversed, which is also a function of price. Because price and distance, as it was computed even for the railroads, is exactly the same thing as is computed by any telephone system in this world. That is, the bulk buyer gets the better rates, whereas the infrequent user gets the highest rates. But what happens is that there is an interdiction that takes place, and that interdiction, yet another mediation between people, and is now machines. And at the same time, what begins to happen is that the cultural structures of each country begin to get broken down. I mean, I think that it is especially meaningful for Japan, having the kind of language that it does, and this is not a criticism, but in fact a statement of admiration. A language of incredible complexity, of elusiveness, of indirection, in which certain sets of words can mean a variety of things, right? Whereas in contradistinction, our language does not proceed in such a difficult manner at all. But the point is, for us, a simple keyboard is enough. The keyboard, in a sense, allows us to create a variety of combinations of languages. The problem for the Japanese, and to an extent for the Chinese, but more so for the Japanese, I believe, will be how to design a keyboard that, in fact, can deal with the whole range that is now available to it. Now, I know this has been a problem in Japan. Now, what will happen? And this is partly what I mean by the cultural change beginning to be imposed by a world that gets more and more hooked up as time goes on. What will that mean? What will happen to your language? If your language must change to adapt to this kind of system, what will happen to the rest of the culture? What will happen to the peculiar uniqueness of not only the Japanese, but of every single ethnicity in the world? Now, there's something to be, there's something disturbing in a sense when the amounts of information become richer and fuller, whereas the quality of the information becomes degraded and less. I don't know what the answer is. I think that it's important to consider always and to keep one's eye on this real world and not this world of illusion, this world of being able to create alternate worlds which one can look at and to an extent become attached to and feel, but not in actuality move in. Now, the question has troubled me for a long time, and I feel that instead of dealing with it in a paper, some kind of only in a theoretical way, addressing the particular issues of communication, bandwidth, chips, so forth and so on, languages, the possibility of artificial intelligence, which I think will never happen, at least not in the sense that we can conceive this as a challenge to our intelligence. I feel the way to deal with this is to at least simulate life by writing a novel, right, which I am doing right now. And what this novel in part contains is the whole question of the illusion and the magic that is created by spending too much time in a computer. For example, what I deal with here is the creation of an invisible country, a land I call Malaputa. And what happens in this is somebody decides to create this country, and what he generates is a set of images as if taken from a satellite and showing what the mineral wealth of this country is. Taking these images, he then proceeds to sell this idea. As money pours into and gets invested into this Malaputa, what happens is the island begins to grow. Now, image-wise, we can generate any kind of world that we want in this. The basic issue is, how can we get people to believe in it? Well, the amount of frauds that have been perpetrated on society in the past have been legion. This is no different. The only thing is that this takes a kind of a technological aspect. Now, you can even people this island with people who are sheer inventions. You can make the island appear as if it's on another planet. And what I'm postulating is not so much a notion of science fiction, where science fiction is laid enough in the future where everything in a sense goes right and nothing really breaks down. What I want to deal with, or what I'm trying to deal with, is the real world today, where in fact everything goes wrong frequently, where in fact there is competition, where theoreticians fight with one another, where chip manufacturers fight with one another, where the competition in terms of business from nation to nation, from company to company, in a sense stops the technology from being fulfilled to its fullest extent. But beyond that, what I want to contrast this invisible realm with is the notion of a real world. And I suggest that what has to happen is that we have to, while we deal with this stuff, while we get overawed by the technology, look around us and see what the world is really like.